Hello and welcome to another episode of Minds Against Dogma.
Hi, Sinziana.
Hi, Joe.
So I think today I'd love to dive into, for the audience, your interest, like how you got interested in UAPs, someone with your background, right, of being an astrophysicist and a hypnotherapist. Where'd you make the leap to getting interested in UAPs and artificial intelligence? I mean, I can kind of see where that comes in, but would you can we talk about that today?
Yes, absolutely. This is a question, especially because these are kind of like my current work projects, two of them. This is a question that I get a lot, and so it's interesting. The UAP thing, I got into it kind of like reluctantly and by accident. To give you a little bit of like the backstory, I was interested in astrophysics from a very young age, but just before I got to be interested just in the astrophysics, or mainly in the astrophysics part of science, when I was a child, if you were to ask me what I want to do when I will grow up, I wanted to then be what I called back then, like I think I was 5 years old or so, I called a biologist astronomer. And for me, a biologist astronomer was someone who studied life on other planets.
Oh, I see. You made up a
A job
title.
for
I
myself.
see a job, biologist astronomer.
Yeah. But
Okay.
then it's like I wasn't that like my interest in biology, especially in the biology that they teach in schools, you know, what like the elementary schools and whatnot was not that interesting to me. And also I got more interested, instead of astronomy and like looking at the stars and the sky and whatnot, I was more interested in cosmology and the big questions and the beginning and the end and all that. And while studying this for a long time, I also didn't get that much into the whole UFO, because back then it was a UFO scene, the UFO, the aliens and all that, because I never submitted to the idea that we are alone in the universe. It made absolutely no sense to me. That was the religious view, that we are at the center of creation and or like at the top level of creation and all that. So it was almost like, yeah, we're not alone. It's not that special, the fact that we're not alone. So it
So it
was
wasn't
more.
a big deal to you. So when they spoke about it, wasn't a big deal to you. You said, of course, there'll be
Of
visiting
course,
or.
the big deal to me was if what we claim are UFOs or like completely unidentified, flying objects from somewhere else, which are extraterrestrial, then how did they get here? That was more of a question for me from the physics perspective, rather than whether they exist or not. Like I wasn't questioning the existence, I was more questioning like the capability necessarily to do what people said they were doing, and how and from where they got here.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that was not necessarily a question that I was willing to go down a rabbit hole to explore necessarily, because I was more interested in the bigger unknowns. So however, as many of us now in this field who just got like recently interested in the field, we got into this accidentally. And yes, I was having this conversation in a podcast with Ryan Graves, who is the pilot who basically the whistleblower to some extent, who caught the attention of Congress and all this institution, and sort of brought back to the attention also of academia some of the things that the pilots are doing. And I was, again, being a physicist interested in dark matter and being a physicist interested in space-time and all these kind of things, of course, you kind of think about what would it take to bend space-time and warp space-time and all these kind of things. But again, for me, it was more like a theoretical exercise in terms of thinking about gravity and all these unknowns in the universe, rather than whether what is reported as an unidentified flying object is extraterrestrial or not. It only was 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, I was consulting for a company that was interested in warp drive physics and alternative propulsion mechanisms. And on how the company was restructured or was structured, the thing was I was actually consulting on the metamaterial side. So not the gravity models, even though my main expertise was actually in the gravity model, but it had to do with the structure and who was in the company and whatnot. So a month or two into that consulting project, I was actually asked to validate some of the gravitational physics models that were circulated as being the next big thing in terms of how to build a warp drive.
What is a warp drive in a nutshell?
So yes, so like the rockets and all these things that like fly far away, they have a sort of propulsion mechanism. So you have an energetic input and more complicated depending on the energy mechanism that propels the rocket. So it's kind of a classical way to look at space travel from my perspective. However, a warp drive, it's basically like, again, built upon Einstein's theories and a couple of new things, metrics and like new physics, basically, even though it's nothing that wasn't expected, so it's not exotic. We know that a certain object with a certain mass can actually bend space-time. Like that's kind of like the definition of mass when you think in terms and Einsteinian terms. It can bend a space-time. It can warp space-time.
Okay. Got it. Yeah,
so a warp drive would be one such object that, again, in some way, because that's another thing, like in what way could you be able to warp space-time in a way in which you don't mess up your timelines? Because that's the thing. Once you go to warping space, you're also getting in trouble with timelines and whatnot. And at the same time, not have the whole Earth fall into whatever warped thing you did, whatever hole you created in space-time, for lack of a better term. So a warp drive is a completely different mechanism than the propulsion one. It has to do with not traveling through our space-time, but actually warping our space-time and then connecting different regions in the universe and all that. So I know it sounds very science fiction.
Well, you just explained something I've been hearing for years, and I never considered that when they said that in Star Trek, right? They needed you on the show to explain this here, that warp drive simply meant you're warping space-time. And I never put those two together, that's what warp drive meant, which makes 100% sense. I mean, that you're warping space-time, warp drive. I'd never even put it together until now. I feel embarrassed that I never thought about that.
I mean, now you know.
Because I understood it. I understood what happens when you warp, space-time. You could go from here to there, but I never put them together that's what warp drive is. Interesting.
Yes. So once I started to look at some of these claims, I was, on one hand, I was pretty much shocked because some of these things were like so obviously unsubstantiated, if you want, because we know, like, if you do a simulation and you change the Einstein's equation and you modify gravity and all these kind of things, there's only a very narrow margin in which you can do that and still have everything else working, for lack of, like, without getting into all the details. You can modify some of these things, but only in a very narrow way, because otherwise you need to still be able to, have satellites and GPS and all these kind of things, and have the Earth, not falling and all these things that we see and observe, which are not questionable. So, and usually people do this type of modifications at a very large scale. I mean, there are different things. Now, it's true that even like as an undergraduate, we were playing with modifying all these things and running a simulation and seeing what happened. I mean, yeah, it was a fun exercise, but it had nothing to do with reality. It was more like just to curiosity and to get, used to the parameters of your code or whatever. And but again, not everyone has gone through the same path in terms of the knowledge that they gain. So I understand how people from outside the field come up with an idea and it may work mathematically on paper, but they don't realize that the implications of that idea, would create all these kind of like troubles with what we see already. So, and this is something that I normally really tell people to be very, very careful about, because if you're not a physicist, and sometimes even if you are, like if you're in a different field and someone tells you that they figured everything out, it's tricky. It's tricky if you really don't know what they're talking about. And so I had to look at several models. So while doing that and realizing that many of them were like absolutely and obviously wrong, some of them were like kind of interesting to explore better, I sort of became what I now call an expert on how not to build a warp drive. So if anyone wants to know how not to build the warp drive, and I can pretty much talk for a long time about many of these claims that are not, but there's no point in doing that because it's like proving that the moon is not made of cheese and things like that, So that's why that's another thing, because there's no point for the community to go against such extraordinary and obviously wrong claims. No scientist would waste their time to try and make an expose or like do this kind of stuff. For them it's like, yeah, I mean, we know this is not how it works. But for someone from outside the field, I can understand how it's very, very tricky to navigate. So if anyone wants to someone to consult on how not to build a warp drive, I'm the person to call. So anyway, I was interested in this research because once I took it more seriously, and by seriously I mean, it's one thing to go to read about this, not to go to, but to read about these festivals. It's like everyone is like dressed as a little green man and have aluminum foils and all these kind of things. So that was kind of like that's the stigma, and but it's also the perception of the UFO kind of field. But the thing is, it's when I started looking more in detail, and I went to this conference in 2022, and I met a couple of people that were really serious about doing actual research in the field. And that's when I met Ryan Graves, who's the pilot, the whistleblower, basically, that brought all these things recently to the attention of Congress and all of that. And then a couple of other scientists like Robert Powell and Peter Reali. And with Robert, we filmed a podcast. He published a paper last year. That's a paper that I wanted to see for such a long time. It's finally looking at the data reported in terms of sightings of UFOs, but in a way that's very scientific, trying to isolate all the properties and the variables and all these kind of things. And it's a work that's been very interesting for me to see, because finally I kind of like have some data to look at. They looked at something like from 1947 to 2016, all the reported in several databases of sightings. I think they started, the number at the beginning was about 100,000, and they by hand isolated the ones that they deem to be reasonable and trustworthy to something like 301 objects. So you can see the difference. And then they said, I mean, okay, their criteria was like, they have to be big enough. We have to have enough light to see the object. The report has to leave away the sensational part of, and we trust more people who are like law enforcement or pilots or people who are educated in the field. So they got to 301, I believe, objects, and we have a podcast in which we kind of like discuss their properties. And also Robert wrote a book about his research in the field. So yes, I met a couple of people who were very interested in doing actual research and taking this seriously and removing it from, the sensational parts. And the more I was looking at sort of models that don't work, like how not to build a warp drive, the more I could come up with ideas of basically how could you build a warp drive. And there are a couple of things that I'm working now. They're related to dark matter and some dark matter properties. Again, it's at the theoretical level. So then you have to put material science and you have to do a couple of other things. So it's like if someone tells you that they know how to build a warp drive, the smartest thing to do is actually leave the conversation. So yeah, it's a field that's only now starting to develop, and that's kind of like how I got into the UAPs. I was also interested, on the other hand, when you think about this field and encounters, I was also interested in the behavioral science aspect of it. I have to be honest here, because as a hypnotherapist, we know how in the subconscious mind things get convoluted between like imagination and dreams and reality and all these kind of things. But I'm sure you had in your practice also like situations in which people would say that they believe, or it would come up in hypnosis, like they had different type of encounters and all these kind of things. And it's one thing when it's in hypnosis, because again, we know how the subconscious mind works and all that. But I was interested, for example, what happened with a bunch of people who kind of like report the same thing. And one example that was very interesting for me to study, even though I didn't do much except watch a documentary, but it was that thing, I don't know if you remember, like a few years back, I think it was in the 90s, when it happened in Zimbabwe, like a school of children who reported seeing this flying saucer basically landing, and had created a media frenzy back then. And then the psychologist from Harvard, John Mack, who went there and interviewed the kids and said, well, this is not deception. Just to, it's like a story, make a long story short. So there was a documentary in 2022 called The Ariel Phenomenon that basically tracked these students, these young children in the future, and so where they were and how they dealt with all this kind of with what happened to them, what they believe happened to them. And so that type of behavioral aspect was very interesting to me to see as well, not necessarily just because of the encounters, but also because of the aftermath.
And what was the aftermath? I don't remember that. I know they kept to their story, but what was the aftermath that made an impression?
It depends. So there are a bunch of interviews with a couple of people who even got together at the school, like all these years later. And some of them were like, they were considering it like a traumatic experience that influenced their life. Some of them to this day were drawing what they saw back then. What's like 20 years in the future. Some of them said that it affects their social life and private lives, because their spouse or their friends don't know about this, and they were trying to keep it quiet. So it was, but it was the thing. That's the thing, right?
It clearly made a mark.
Yeah, a very significant event in their lives. And none of them, from, again, the perspective of the documentary filmmaker, were saying anything different, in the sense that none of them was kind of like leaking that it was all a hoax or like all a, a lie or something like that. So there was no such thing in even 20 years in the future. So that was the other aspect. And also it has to do with, this is something that Robert and I discussed during our podcasts as well, is when you have this type of encounters, sometimes we know how like the sensorial experience works and all these kind of things. And it's a very interesting conversation to have. How much is it just our senses kind of projecting things? How much is reality in what we see? For many of these sightings, there's not actually radar data. So you're basically just basing your, model on what people say that they were seeing. And we know very well that our senses are not 100%, accurate when it comes to registering and transmitting information. So there are a lot of questions here also from the human perspective when you think about these things, not just the physics perspective of like, okay, what are these objects, and if they're not from here, how did they get here? And again, at the beginning, when people were talking about UAPs, including at the beginning when Congress got interested and all that, it was still circulating the idea that it might be something else, like terrestrial or from a different, country or something like that. The more I talk with people now, and even Ryan was mentioning this, is now it's kind of, the more you look at this data and the more you see what can be done, it's pretty hard to believe that there's somewhere that technology already here. And that's why
even if it's like black projects, deep military, like DARPA kind of stuff, you still think that that's just too far out, even for that, even, yeah?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. Again, this is a thing with it's one of those projects in which people should be from completely different fields working together, because decent consciousness, and this is not just a matter of physics and behavioral science and data manipulation and telescopes and whatnot. It's such a complex thing that you should have a bunch of people like working together from different fields trying to figure out what this is and what is going on. And there are some efforts that are starting now to look at this seriously in academia, but there's so much data already there that one can use if we trust the data and see, at least think about, okay, how would you be able to build something like that? So yeah, we don't have like, there are so many parts to that technology besides the gravitational thing that I just mentioned to you. There are all sorts of other things, like the materials that are used, and the level of understanding right now is basically, so there have been a couple of papers done in the theoretical field of warp drives. They don't mention anything about extraterrestrials and UAPs, so you can understand how different these kind of things are, especially when the academia gets involved. But theoretically, like it's a Barcelo et al., it's a group in Spain, and they collaborate with people from a couple of other countries. They wrote a few years back a paper saying that, okay, depending on what metric you use, if you were to use that metric in one dimension, you wouldn't be able to escape like all these sorts of paradoxical problems that you might encounter. And that was kind of it for a while, because if you cannot do it in 1D, the extrapolation, and again, our sense of generalization was you're not going to be able to do it in 3D. And it was also the year 2022 when they wrote a paper that was a very interesting paper, in which they realized that actually in 3D you can. And depending on the shape on the trajectory that you're using, you might be able to be in a way in which you can have that stabilized. And the interesting thing, again, they don't mention UAPs or UFOs or anything like that, but the interesting thing that they do say, again, depends on the shape of the object. You have to do all these sort of like maneuvers that don't necessarily make much sense, the chaotic type of maneuvers that people have been observing when you talk about UAPs and UFOs and all this kind of stuff. So that was an interesting hint that there is theoretically a way and also a connection with what we see in the data in order on how to build this type of things. And then there are many, many other questions. For example, one of the, again, when you look at the data, it's very hard to explain it right away unless you have one of those objects in front of you and you have a telescope and you have all the sorts of measurements and 10,000 radars and all this kind of stuff, like if you're prepared for it. But many people talk about super speeds, right? And that's because we think in terms of what humans would do. And even there, I'm not sure that that's the correct way of looking at things, because we have the impression of ourselves as a species that we are very like effective and efficient and reasonable and rational and all that. And that's not necessarily the case for most humans. So when you see an object here and then a similar object, because again, it's a certain distance, or even like something that looks exactly like that or similar, at a completely, like, I don't know, 60 miles in a few seconds, or like in an instance, as you would say, you assume that that object is moving with a very high speed, something that we don't have here. Now, to be the devil's advocate, the first question that comes to mind for me is, how do you know it's the same object? Because there might be an explanation in which there's a cloaking mechanism. And again, there we are closer in terms of our understanding of science. I mean, in terms of metamaterials and all this kind of stuff, we have now like high refractive index metamaterials. So there are a couple of things in the materials world that is not...
Oh, I see.
You cannot cloak a flying object right now, but how do you know that there's not something like that? And there are several...
Like there are two different objects or several objects, and they're just going in and out of visibility, and you're thinking they're moving because one is here and then the other one is there.
Of course. So you don't really know that.
Yeah.
And again, for many of these objects, there is no radar data. And even with the radar data, one can say, it's like, okay, but the radar basically is like a beam sent to that object. So if you have a way of like absorbing, deflecting, or something like that, even with the radar, you could still have the same type of thing happening. So if you don't have that type of continuity that we kind of like make up with our mind and eyes when we see moving objects, might just be an illusion. It might be, of course, then there are reports in which people have seen the same thing, like not moving at a high distance, but doing maneuvers that for that size of the object and at that speed or like that altitude and all those kind of things would not be possible with the current technology. So there are things like that too. But again, statistically, think about the fact that out of 100,000 reports, just with those criteria that I just mentioned, you get to 301 in what's like 70 plus 75 years. No, it was not 2024, it was until 2016. But, you know, so it's hard to start, especially in academia right now, a project and say, okay, we're starting to look now. And for how long is the first question? Are you going to get funding to do this thing for like 50 years? Is 10 enough? Because the most interesting such sightings and encounters that you read about are actually a one-off. For example, the Commander Fravors explanation and story about seeing that UFO years ago, that was the one time in a whole career that they saw something like that. On the other hand, what Ryan Graves was talking about is in his fighter jet unit, people would see that every day.
Really, every day, every
or
day.
it's like
But it was that common. It happened all the
it was
time.
very common to the point that they were kind of like when you had a newbie.
Was it the same object all the time? That like that type,
No.
different types all the time,
Yeah.
different shapes and.
Yeah. So, but there's no actual, account of that in terms of what's the shape, sizes, and all this kind of stuff. There was not a program to deal with these kind of things. And yeah, I mean, so many things that can be done here. Also, from my perspective, and I'm interested in and working with biofeedback and neurofeedback, and I proposed that. And again, it's like no one was offended because I wasn't necessarily going to use it as a lie detector. But when you're like a fighter jet pilot in a mission, that's a hyper alert state. One can even say hyper suggestible state. So there are a ton of things that can be influencing what it is that you see. And if these things happen, and sometimes there's electromagnetic activity related to it, either like blocking radars or things like that, what would that do to the human body would be interesting to see. So hooking someone with a biofeedback device when they do this type of missions, and especially when they have this type of encounters and looking at the data would be, I understand that is kind of like a red tape hell, basically. But I mean, that would be an interesting thing to understand. And I'm sure like right now, maybe that's not possible, but in a few years, that would kind of help us understand more about the topic from the perspective of what it is that we see, what it is that those things are, what's their effect on us, combined with theoretically at least thinking like how would you be able to warp space-time. And I say warp now because I looked at many of the propulsion systems that one can envision so far, as opposed to the warping space-time, are not explaining the type of things that we kind of get from the reported data. So you need more than an advanced propulsion system. You need something on the side of warping space-time to get those movements and speeds and so on. So yeah, I mean, advanced propulsion, it's an interesting thing to have and to study regardless, but you're already at a different level when you're talking about warping space-time, because you're not actually going through the space-time, with a high speed and all these kind of things. And
let me interrupt you for a second. I just have a question. While you were talking before, providing it's not that cloaking device, which is really interesting. Of course, that would make sense, right? If it's cloaking and it's here and there, you would think it's moving. But providing it's not a cloaking device, I got this image of how mirage, the heat, distorts light, and therefore we see things change and are not what we're looking at. So in a sense, the warp drive would be changing space-time, and that would make sense that what we're seeing would be moving from one space to another instantaneously, because instead of warping light, it's literally warping space-time. And so you would be having a similar experience of what you're seeing is changing immediately based on what's happening to the environment, right?
So that's why, because I mean, in terms of propulsion, now you would think in classical terms, like you have high speed, high acceleration, right? When you talk about warp drive, those are not quantities involved, you have lines, basically space-time lines, from falling basically from one to the other in space-time. But to distinguish the eye perception, is not just the eye, because I mean, yeah, of course it can be just the eye that sees something here, and especially if you look at the sky, if it's too much light, how the retina retains information for a longer time, and then you project it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So this can happen, of course. This can be like an illusion, like an optical illusion. But these things have been like Commander Fravor, for example, because that's the most known example. These have been also on the radar. So it appears on the radar somewhere else. Now, this also doesn't.
So it's disappearing on the radar and then showing up immediately somewhere else.
Yeah, but this is also not completely unexplainable by a cloaking mechanism. Because again, a radar has, you send the radiation and you get back the signal. So if you have a mechanism in which that doesn't get back, like either gets, there's so many things that can happen. It can still be an explanation for what it appears and disappears. So this is one of the examples in which we look at this data from our perspective of what would make sense, Yeah. Another thing in terms of suggestibility, because we were speaking about this being hyperactive and being very suggestible to a certain thing. I had an encounter, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it because I think it's very interesting on how to, some of these things that we believe we see are actually very easily explainable. For example, after coming back from the conference, and again, I was very suggestible to the topic, and back then I didn't have access to all these databases that and all this data that Robert Powell analyzed. So I was asking, there's a company called Enigma Lab, and they were working on an app in which anyone who sees anything, they can, plug in the coordinates, describe it, and so on, like people do, like they chase the northern lights doing these kind of things and so on. So I asked them, what's the most predominant shape, for example? And they were actually telling me that it's actually not a flying saucer, but again, those were amateur, anyone who sees something like put it in an app. So it wasn't a very rigorous analysis and study. So they said something about dark black triangles, and then they said 3 lights in the sky, like 3 lights as in at nighttime, you'd see 3 lights in the sky moving. So with that in mind, I was in, we were in Malta, and which is an island in the Mediterranean Sea. We were in Malta, and was this very beautiful sort of like harbor and lagoon, and we were at a restaurant. The image was like it was fantastic, the view, the food was great, the wine was amazing, but not that much. And at some point we see 3 lights in the sky, and again, the wine was good, but not that much. And they start moving in exactly this kind of zigzagging, chaotic way. So for me, that was it. Okay, this is it, people. This is the encounter now. This is the object. We tried to, again, at night is very different because we could see the planes from the airport. So we would try to see, okay, what's the distance based on how we would see them with the plane, and what's the distance and how big is the object, depending on where we see them. And taking movies, videos of the whole thing, doing all sorts of things. So we were there, like believing, like we really wanted to believe, and we were at that edge of believing that that's a thing. And we see some silhouettes, human silhouettes, by the way, on top of a rooftop, very like sort of under that object. And my first question was, why aren't they filming? Because I couldn't see any light from like a screen or a video. It's like, why aren't they filming that thing? Because they were looking at it. So they must see it. Fast forward a few minutes, and we did realize that they were actually filming with the said drone.
Ah, wow.
Once they do this and it lands, we do realize like that's a drone. But just building on the suggestibility and the expectation and what we knew, and the fact that it didn't make sense that it moved like that, and it looked like it was bigger and further away because of, it was a drone.
Yeah.
So we got back to the food and the wine, realizing, again, had we left before they landed it, all of us would have been, okay, cheers to that. It finally happened. Yeah, we had an encounter. Well done. But seeing the end result and realizing there was a rational, reasonable explanation for what we saw, but it can happen. I understand how drones are a big problem when you come to looking at these objects and not identifying them properly.
Yeah, that's that's something to always consider.
And what was the other question? The other question was with AI.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you have more questions about the UAPs.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, like, do you think there are beings in there, or do you think that it's something else?
So that's a nice segue to get into the AI discussion. For a long time, right, we saw that those have to be extraterrestrial beings. And that was another question, like how long can they live if they come from,
Yeah.
the outskirts?
And not to mention the G forces, but I guess if they're warping space time, they wouldn't have G forces. But yeah.
But I mean, even so, it's like, okay, are you connecting? Are you making a wormhole? Are you connecting two regions of space and time, or do you still even warping space time? You need to, first of all, travel again, bend it, but also kind of like you have to not swallow Earth. You know what I mean? And all these kind of things. So it's still a question about what type of biology and all those type of things. But again, now we have the technology to do AI and to pilot remotely drones and planes and cars and whatnot. So that question is pointless. We don't know, but they wouldn't need to if they are at least as advanced as us to have that technology. And again, we keep thinking about these problems in terms of what would humans would do. And usually the example of that, when people say, why would they have 10 objects and cloak in and out instead of one, or like why would they do that? We send a Tesla into space playing Space Oddity, was piloted by Starman. Hello. Think about what the different species would try to analyze us, like, let's think about the reason behind that, and what that would tell about civilization. So yeah, we're not monuments of, having everything done in an effective and efficient manner, and like being guided by, I don't know, minimalist view, like have one warp drive instead of 10,
Right. And then they could be completely automated through, robotics and AI that they're not even doing any of it at this point. So it's funny because I was talking to a couple of people at a party the other night, and one was a social worker, another one was a hypnotherapist, another one a LMFT therapist. And we were talking about AI, and someone said, do you think your job is safe with AI? Because no job is safe with AI. And we started talking about the ideas behind that. Like, what are your thoughts about that? What are your thoughts about AI taking the place of interpersonal services like therapy, for example?
That like in terms of AI, now we use it for a lot of things. And one of the things that we use it for is data analysis in many, many different fields. So one of my projects that I've been telling you about is, because AI has two components here, like the capability of analyzing data in a very fast manner, and the capability of analyzing a lot of data in a very quick manner, and also kind of like giving automated feedback basically right away with the type of data that is analyzing. And while in some fields it's obvious the way you would use it, like you have a ton of data from observations that you take through the telescope. So instead of having one poor PhD student looking at all this data, you build a program, a machine learning program, and that's being done automatically. I was talking with Robert about AI use in this type of data when you have hundreds of thousands of reports, and whether they would be able to find the same correlations that a human could, and all these kind of things. For me, there were two things that attracted me to actually building an AI tool for profiling and also hypnotherapy. The first one was indeed the profiling, because I think that that's such an important part of therapy in how you tailor it to the actual person. Forget about types of people, And there's so many things, like what we would do is like test suggestibility, and then test the behavioral profile, and then maybe do one of those personality tests to see where the person is, but none of those tests are actually exhaustive. Like, I couldn't find one that can explain, everything. And then you'd figure out whether they're auditory and visual and all these kind of things. An AI an AI that is trained. See, I'm already personalizing my clone, my AI clone, my therapist. So an AI would be able to do that very quickly. And it's also easier because think about the fact that if you were to analyze all the people in the world, like how they speak, how they present themselves, all these kind of things, you would be able to understand, to do profiling correctly, right? It has to do with whether a person speaks in a certain, like whether they use the second person when they talk about something negative or positive, whether they project on themselves. It's like so many things that you can understand from a person's speech, and many other things like ground and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, we know just from handwriting alone, you can learn a lot from a person just by their handwriting. So I would imagine AI would start picking up patterns in ways that we didn't even consider, pupil dilation at certain words and things like that, right?
And again, it's just analyzing a huge amount of data in a short amount of time. So if you speak with a person for 5 minutes and you ask them to give you a recording about, like, let's say, what they want to work on and all this kind of stuff, an AI would bring the suggestibility and all these kind of things in an instance. Like if you go to the Magic Castle, and I was there recently, to the Magic Castle in the Academy of Magical Arts in Hollywood, and some of these people who are hypnotists and hypnotherapists, I mean, for me, right away, I can act as a somnambulist, and I can act as like high emotional, and it's like I know how to react to this type of thing.
For people that don't understand, I want to back up just a little bit so they know what we're talking about, who don't understand hypnosis in that sense, which is, in simple terms, human beings have basically these defense mechanisms that stop a thought, an idea, from being fully accepted by deeper parts of the brain and mind, and therefore body, and then behavior, and then results. And these defense mechanisms, it's a confluence of limiting decisions, belief systems, personality types, and all this stuff. And by understanding the person and their defense mechanisms, and understanding how to communicate to that specific person, providing they want the idea in, which is the most important defense to bypass, which is the willingness to allow an idea in, that these AI profiling programs can help us to bypass that, and those defense mechanisms. And there are many, and different people have different ways of communicating and taking in information or accepting information. And essentially, that's what we're doing. We're allowing a deeper idea that's stronger than the presenting idea to move into the subconscious, and let the other idea be less important and less fundamental in the person's behavior and achieving a goal, or just their personality, as far as how they deal with things. So go ahead. I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure for people didn't.
Absolutely. And to give like a more concrete example, is something as simple like, let's say if someone takes information directly, to have the AI or the therapist giving them the information directly. Of course, we know with someone who's literal, you can give it inferential as well. It's the other way around. That's a bit tricky, but you know what I mean. Then if someone is more visual, you can have the app kind of like building an induction that's more on a visual thing, or then using the language that's more, you see how this is, when someone is so having like control issues and this type of defense mechanism that you were talking about earlier, you don't tell me what to do, I have to understand it, process it, it has to come from me, all this kind of stuff. You're not going to say, do this. You're going to say, why don't you? Why wouldn't you? So all these kind of things, we're not robots in terms of like us, with the therapists, we're not robots. So even if we're good at doing this type of things, an AI wouldn't have any, issue in terms of saying, oh, I'm actually an inferential, and now I have to speak in a certain way with you, without sounding that I'm not authentic in my, an AI would be that person, exactly delivering this information as it's as you need it. So this year, last year I already started studying the profile in order to understand myself how I would teach an AI to profile. And I have together this class that's kind of like profiling 101, but it's more for, interactions and things that people can learn in like 16 hours on how to look at these language patterns and understanding other people, be it for, partnerships and different positions in different companies, or just communication. I found out very interesting. One of the first things when I started learning this was movies. I would look very differently as a script, like a dialogue in a movie. And it's more in a movie than it is in a book, because in a book you can imagine a person who can actually match that profile, even though they say things a bit differently. But for me, there were many instances when I would watch a movie and knowing what I know now about the profile, saying is like, yeah, no, that person would never say anything like that, or would not say it this way, So it's a lot. It's like a rabbit hole of knowledge once you start going down this route. And the other thing with it is, I was trying, especially once I developed the neurosensorial programming approach technique with hypnosis, I wanted to use it on myself. But the difference between self-hypnosis and hypnosis, and how much more effective hypnosis is than self-hypnosis, because of the depth and because of all these other things that are happening. And not to sound like a complete, like an inflated ego, but I didn't find an option on how to have someone use that for my particular profiling and issue and all these kind of things. So I was thinking, it's like, okay, I'm just going to clone myself into an AI therapist. As scary as this sounds, and as like certifiable as this may sound to some people, but there are advantages when you think in these terms. First of all, with some techniques, it's going to be way more effective and efficient than a person. And one of the most important things here is the moment it figures out your profile. We know that hypnosis basically is like delivering suggestions and information. So you have to do it in the way that it would be most received. And even the best hypnotherapists, some with experience in acting as well, hint, hint, can deliver that better than other people, because they can change the way they transmit information and all these kind of things, that very well. And the problem is with the subconscious, sometimes, depending on how it is trained and depending on your profile, can pick up on those things that are not 100% authentic. So if you change your, and I'm not talking about you personally, but in general, like script to deliver the information to a person because they're more like X, Y, and Z in how they receive information and how they process information, they can still pick up on things that are not exactly as you would normally do that. An AI doesn't have this problem. Right. An AI would be able to deliver the information precisely tailored for the person's profile and with absolutely none of those things. Of course, the human aspect is always important, and especially for people, for example, who are more used to the human connection. those people are not going to use an AI because they're not going to, it's a different thing. They want to be seen and heard by someone human. There's an empathy there. There's a report. There's a connection there. And especially like people who are more kinesthetic, for example, those are going to be in a one-to-one session rather than, even on Zoom. And so there are different aspects like that. And again, it's the intuition, because after a certain amount of time, therapists develop an intuition about where to go and what to, so it's not just that they're biased, it's also they have a lot of experience and they can pick up on this stuff. So I'm not going to say that it's going to completely take over the field, but for some people, for example, like me, and for some techniques is way more, it will be, because again, it's in developmental stages, more effective and efficient. Especially giving all this information that I just talked to you about, like if they do the profiling right and they learn the techniques, and then you're going to be able to find in a feedback loop more easily the correlations between certain presenting issues and certain types of personality. So it's a research tool as well in doing that. So there's the benefit of reaching out a huge number of people and understanding and learning more. And one of the fields I think that the AI is going to change completely the paradigms is psychology and behavioral science, for this simple reason that because you have your sample is so large, can be so large when you use an AI, you're going to overturn many of the models that were done because you did a study with 1,000 people. 1,000 people is a huge study by psychology and whatnot. 1,000 people who already, if you think about the bias, the first bias is they already accept it to be part of your study. Right. That already tells a lot about the profiling of a person.
That's the pushback against the social sciences. Often, it's usually. It doesn't take into consideration all the data that AI can consider in those situations. It's much bigger samples, and it can look for patterns that humans wouldn't even consider, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, again, if it's programmed correctly, yes. Right. So yeah, this is my connection with AI right now, and I'm working on developing such a tool. Yeah, I keep telling people that once I'm gonna be in a testing phase with the profiling part, I'm gonna have a party, and I'm gonna lose half of my friends. What do you mean? I'm not a projector. Well, my AI says you are. So
it's exciting where it's going, and yeah. Well, thank you. That sounds really fun. I'd love to see what happens in another 4 months from now, since we.
Me too.
Kind of results. We've had those kind of results in 4 months. I can't imagine. Using peripheral biofeedback and neurofeedback, you become an AI machine in that sense, where you're looking for correlations between the suggestion and their heart rate variability, skin temperature, muscle tension, whether they're resisting suggestions or not. And if you put that in an AI and it started noticing the patterns and started carving out ways in which to bypass those defense mechanisms based on the peripheral biofeedback and neurofeedback, that would be really interesting. I mean, there's no end where this can go. It's really interesting. It's like we're headed in places that.
It's exactly to what you were saying, like that is the ideal scenario in which everyone has a biofeedback, neurofeedback, very light, very portable, very smart device, research grade if it would be possible, but not something that's the research grade that takes 1 hour and a half to, arrange, and it's like it takes something like 5 minutes. Then you have the AI app. You're doing all these kind of things. So you're getting the AI understands like, okay, with this variability and with this profile, this is the presenting issue. I give these suggestions. This is what happens. imagine like if you have that type of information for, even, I'm not even thinking in terms of millions, like if you have it for 10,000 people, what type of correlations you can come up with and see it in real time, like see exactly what's happening and then adjust, right? Because if you see, okay, I gave this suggestion and this didn't happen in the change, like adjust. So that would be the ideal thing. And then you can think about something that like scares a lot of people. I mean, I'm not that scared about that because I believe that we as humans, and I'm talking about the biology now and the physiology, we would have to evolve at some point. I mean, I like experiencing the world also in reality, not in a virtual reality. And that's because I might be born before the whole thing with the AI and like people living on their phones. So maybe it's because I'm part of that generation, but I still like to experience the world in reality. So for me, I would like to have a body that's evolved in terms of like also perception and memory and whatnot. Well, these are more mental faculties, but the sensorial approach is different, in which I can keep up with the virtual revolution, if you will. And what I mean by that, I would like to think, can this help us have enhanced abilities? Can this help us with the memory? Which to me, well, it's, very well, is one of my frustrations with people not remembering things, even though they're constantly in this world of information. Like if you're in hypersuggestibility and your brain is completely overloaded in your senses as well, you're not going to have the time for that because your brain hasn't evolved to keep up with this, to have the time for that information to be processed, to sink in, for you to then remember it. So it goes everywhere. So
Yeah, it seems like augmented reality versus virtual reality, because augmented reality gives you an opportunity to blend new ideas with the presenting experience, and virtual reality is akin to complete escapism into something else that you don't even need to be present to what is. You can just escape into something else. A friend of mine came over the other night with the virtual reality, augmented reality device. It was really profound, and I thought about how helpful that would be in integrating new ideas with presenting ideas. And that's exactly what it sounds like you're talking about, is being present to what is, but having data processing of what is through an intention, and an end result, and using everything as feedback to get to that result. So it just makes everything. I'm one of those people, kind of an old timer, saying, let's go back to the wheel, but but when you think about how efficient things can be through that lens, with this, as long as you're keeping your intent, your intention, where you're headed, and you're just seeing it as efficient processing, and faster feedback loops to get somewhere. I can see how it's exciting, actually, not so scary.
yeah, it is exciting. And it's I'm when I said enhanced abilities, I meant many different things. Like you
Yeah.
can use it for sports, you can use it for your body to kind of like burn more energy. We know the mind over body. That's a whole other discussion for a whole other podcast. But there's so many things that you can make a human better by using these capabilities. And now, to address the question that everyone is like so scared, what do you mean? An AI hypnotizing you? What do you mean by that? But this is also because, first of all, there's a stigma and a misunderstanding and a myth about hypnosis and what hypnosis actually does. We're
Right.
not going to go over it necessarily now. There's a podcast about that. But also because it's something, for many people, it's synonymous with relinquishing control, like losing control. And then having an AI that might be, nefarious, let's say. So in this type of apps, you can put way more fail safes that you can put to a human. That's one thing.
Right.
The other thing is, most of the people who are going to use this app are actually, because that's the whole point, are actually going to be in the comfort and in the place of their own home. They're not going to be, it's not an app that you can listen to on your way to work. Let's put it this way. And never. And also because this is not how hypnosis works. And if you have something like an AI that gets you, yeah, of course, they can be hacked, and yeah, but they're not going to make you do something nefarious, because hypnosis doesn't work like that. And then if an AI gets the feedback that something uncomfortable is going there, you can make it stop, make it turn off by itself, say, get you out of hypnosis. So there's so many things that I know people are scared about it. But honestly, in terms of, especially knowing the previous, Emptor and all these kind of like experiments, I would personally be way more afraid of a human than an AI to do this type of things. And hashtag trust issues, if you will. But then it depends, because
hashtag auditory digital.
digital, exactly, of course.
Okay. Yeah.
And even more so, hashtag somnambulism.
Yeah.
That's why an AI is much faster at dehypnotizing you than a human is.
Mm.
Because we're so suggestible to humans as part of our evolution. To be able to be dehypnotized at the same time being suggestible to, because humans are always going to be in a sort of like a loophole of interaction. Doesn't matter how detached you are, there's always that kind of interaction that's almost, ooh. With an AI, that thing is very different. So you're not picking up as a somnambulist with all the cues, like the breathing, the differences in the voice and all that. An AI doesn't have those kind of things, So it's much easier to kind of be dehypnotized by an AI than it is to be by a human, which is one of the most the first things that we do, depending on the presenting issue. We dehypnotize the person to a previous
distortion.
Depending on what, yeah.
Well, it's exciting to see where this is going to go.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how this develops and what it comes up with, because as I said, in terms of profiling, I'm actually interested to see what type of correlations you can find that we just don't know, because we don't have enough data to compare it by. It's like enough, a large enough sample. So, I mean, yeah, some of the stuff can be very obvious for someone who has been doing this for a while. Like, okay, that person is more visual, that person is more like, this is a digital, these kind of things. But then there's so much more that you can learn and understand. And for some techniques is extremely good, when like that type of neurosensorial processing, especially because it can create also for visual people, visual inductions and these kind of things. There's always going to be a more, empathetic and human approach in terms of hypnosis. So depending on exactly what techniques you're using. And then imagine it's like an AI is way easier to connect it directly to a biofeedback device,
That's essentially what it is. It's just like a neurofeedback session where you first have a conversation with them, you understand the intention, you understand how last week went, and then you just hook them up. And it's, sometimes it modulates automatically, and sometimes it's an intention, it's an idea. And so it's the same thing. Like you can use it as the therapist in the beginning, and then you can just hook it up and let the AI do the rest, to pace and lead them. So it seems like it can be a nice adjunct to it.
Yes. Right? Yeah, I think it's, I mean, again, I don't want to get too excited about it, but I think the possibilities are,
yeah.
fascinated in using AI. And I know I want to say one more thing, because I understand how people might be like scared, like really, I mean, you're teaching an AI to like, are you mad? So I understand that there's this kind of like a scary aspect to it when you have a machine doing something that is considered to be so personal and private and all that. And you can think about like all the mind control things and all this, that type of stuff. But I mean, people have been using these tools for a very long time in data analysis and feeding us back the results in marketing and all these kind of things, like ads and all this kind of stuff. This would be one way to actually use it for good. And there's so many apps already that use imagery and guided meditations and all these kind of things. So this would actually be a perfectly tailored tool to reach a lot of people in terms of therapy and many other things. So yes, there is that scary aspect, that
I can already hear the conspiracies already with AI.
Yeah, I know it's a scary thought for some, but when you actually think about it, television has been doing that to you for like decades, so it's nothing in that
Yeah.
is, so when used correctly and when used properly and when I think it's an amazing tool.
So what's interesting is that AI can increase the evolution of communication, which is suggestive ideas from one person to another, very much like hypnosis has increased over the years, right? From an authority figure god looking at information, because basically hypnosis is an idea accepted. And oftentimes in the past, it started with the greatest idea, which is some scripture, some God, or some authority figure giving you an idea, and you accept it. And then it became
So the
someone
voice of the high priests and high priestesses, right?
exactly, and also kings, and so we keep now to the news. We get some authority figure on the news, and it usually happens naturally when we're scared or confused or overloaded. We look for that one that is very certain in their communication, and that we deem an authority figure or an expert. And then John Kappas, the founder of HMI, he recognized that some people actually rejected authority and direct suggestions from someone in authority. So inferential communication worked better with others, right? And then Milton Erickson came along and said, well, no, if you actually become one with that person by pacing and matching them, you create this symbiotic loop, feedback loop, that you can start building new ideas on the accepted ideas. And then that's where we are now. And so maybe AI can take us to what aliens are doing, which is basically telepathy, as far as communication, where you don't need to do anything but vibrate at a certain frequency to communicate, effectively to somebody.
Yeah, I wouldn't jump that far, because it's like I always have that problem with the vibrating at frequencies, when we have it's a different discussion. But for example, imagine the other thing, because you talked about John Kappas and Milton Erickson and all that. Imagine the guys that kind of like built the NLP model. What Grinder and right? It's like, what could they have done with an AI?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, with an AI and the whole study of neuro-linguistic patterns and all that, and how to frame them in the NLP model with an AI, they would have been. And again, this is what we're doing. We're building upon their knowledge.
Yeah.
The next stage. So one of the things that is interesting, and in terms of telepathy, like if you look at this project that are now like Neuralink and all these kind of things, basically having a person's thoughts mapped out and downloaded through a network, through the Wi-Fi, through your phone, into someone else's map, that's sort of telepathy. I mean, we're almost there, and we always thought that this is like a human biological superpower. We're gonna have to evolve biologically for us to use telepathy. No, you just need devices that map this thing and download
interface,
the electromagnetic impulses in different parts of the brain download it in someone else's brain. It's not nothing, that's now science fiction. We're getting there. And with AI, it's because you have access to so much information, almost like in milliseconds. For you to learn how to get all these communication skills, let's say, it's way faster. So, any more questions, Joe? Or
No, I think it's very exciting. Just wait until I retire before this kicks in.
Yeah, I'm not saying I will, but I will definitely, you'll be on the board. Let's put it this way. You'll be on the board of the company. So your experience is invaluable. It will always be used. And also you're going to be one of the first persons to test the AI. So let's put it like that. If it passes your tests, then I think we're on the right track.
This world can use any help it can get. So yeah, if it retires me, so be it. If it's efficient, then let's champion it. And speaking of, since my AI robot hasn't learned to make me dinner yet, I'm gonna go. But it's been really interesting talking to you today and hearing all about this leap you've made from a child who's wanted to be a astrobiologist to actually working that you can actually 3 or 4 or 5 sciences together, the confluence of all your passions into one potential life-changing modality.
Yeah, I mean, one can call that hashtag commitment issues, but I actually subscribe more to the model that your description of like bridging things together, an interdisciplinary approach. And yes, I mean, thank you again, and hopefully see you in the next episode, which is going to be the interview with Robert Powell. So this is more like an introduction to how I got into the field and where the field is right now, and we're gonna be speaking more about UAPs in that interview.
And that will make us more mad.
More mad, yes.
I'm Joe Tabbanella.
I'm Sinziana Paduroiu, and this is Minds Against Dogma.